Foreign Office, November 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. That's the Balfour Declaration. And my name is Geoffrey Clarfield, and I'd like to welcome you to this event. I'm the Executive Director of the Mansur Freedom Foundation, the Speakers Action Group, and the Project Manager of Canadians for Balfour 100, which is a special project of the Speakers Action Group. Tonight, like yourselves, I came here to listen to three remarkable men who are called public intellectuals, and very often that's used as a snide and sarcastic thing, but I think we have to recognize it for the truth that it is, and it's a tradition that goes back to the Athenian Agora, when Socrates took philosophy to the street. And so, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to this event this evening, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will be managing the rest of the evening, Miles Smith. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Thanks to all of you for joining this evening. My purpose is to say as little as possible so that we have as much time together with all of you and with our very distinguished panelists. We're delighted to have everyone here. And the only purpose I have at start is a few words of honors and a few words of housekeeping. As regards the honors, obviously we're honored to have all of you here to commemorate in discussion a historic milestone in the liberation of the Middle East from strife and what we hope will be an ongoing history of reconsecration of the region to peace. We are honored to be effecting the collaboration of four terrific organizations, the Canadians for Balfour 100, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, the Speakers Action Group, and the Mansur Freedom Foundation. It's a privilege to work with these people, and I'd like to say on everyone's behalf a word of thanks and honor for a chance to work together with the army of volunteers who made this event come together so smoothly, who've seen you to your seats, and who've provided you with materials and made everything run, as well as, of course, the staff here at the Isabel Bader Theatre. It's an honor to work with Goldie and Geoffrey and Irving and Shirley Ann, who, by the way, is having a birthday today on this event. And of course, finally, it is really an honor to be on stage with these three fine fellows. It's a pan-Abrahamic panel, and it is individuals who are 100% Stockholm Syndrome free. The elaborated bios are found in your material, so I'll just say a sort of descriptive word of why these three people came to the attention of Canadians. Salim Mansur is one of the most prominent and early Canadians to ask why, whether it's in a country like India or whether it's in Canada, Muslims or people of any faith can't have both their religion and their culture on the one hand and Shakespeare on the other hand. Ezra is probably the one who first taught Canadians always to bring your own camera with you to an interview, especially if it's with an administrative law body. And also, I think he taught us that if someone takes your megaphone away, you can always get your own and build your own media empire, which is inspiring in an age in which we seek to have as many voices. Jordan Peterson is well known to many of you by now. We had him at an event that, although it was free, sold out, so to speak, before many of us in the organization even knew it was being held. And for a lot of young Canadians and people of student age, part of the interest may be that he's the first person that they've seen demonstrate what it's like to take a high-profile stand for free speech, especially in the service of broader and free inquiry. And I think he also taught us the value of that adage that sometimes you have to punch the wall because there's actually no wall there. So with that, a few words of housekeeping. We're going to hear from each of our panelists for about 20 minutes, and the perspective very broadly is on the Balfour Declaration and significance not just for the Jewish community or Israel as a nation, but also for Christians and Jews. They'll take very wide-ranging perspectives, and we hope that that will spark questions from you. So by way of housekeeping, what we'll look to do is our two stalwart ushers, Guido and Michael, are happy to take cue cards from you on which you can put your questions, and those will be filtered through and passed on to the panel during our Q&A session. We hope to hear a lively and interesting and wide-ranging dialogue from that. There are accessible washrooms here on this floor to the right and again to the right outside the theater, and there are men's and women's washrooms downstairs. I would invite you to turn any communications and noise-making devices off, just so that we can focus on the here and the now. And you'll also find in the package that you were given 2 feedback forms, as well as some material about the historical context, and we'd very much like to have your feedback. We will hear first from Dr. Salim Mansur, and then from Ezra, and finally from Jordan Peterson. So it's my first pleasure to welcome to the stage, if that's where he'd like to make his remarks, Salim Mansur.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you and the organizers, and I also want to congratulate them for taking the time, putting in the effort to get this event to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration was, in a sense, the keystone in the plinth, the foundation that was laid, which eventually led to the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel in 1948. So I want to begin with a little bit of history and then put it in some context, the Balfour Declaration, and sum up my own thoughts in terms of what could and might have been possible and the missed opportunities, in a sense. The Balfour Declaration was simply, in the beginning, November 1917, a letter written on behalf of the British government by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, and addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was representing the Zionists in Britain, the Zionist organization in Britain, indicating to them that the British government would be willing to see that a Jewish homeland is established in Palestine. It was a statement, a letter, a policy, and no more than that. It could have been revoked at any other time. In fact, the weeks following the letter sent to Lord Rothschild, the government of David Lloyd and his emissaries were engaged in secret negotiation with representative of the Ottoman ruler, Enver Pasha, in Geneva, Switzerland, trying to see if they could arrange a separate peace with the Ottomans and get them out of the war so that the Entente powers, Britain, France, Russia, could then concentrate on defeating Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire And it's one of the big ifs. If the Ottoman had gone along with that secret negotiation, what would have happened? The statement that had been released to Lord Rothschild. So in a sense, the Balfour Declaration survived. It was translated later on into an agreement, a treaty, recorded into the United League of Nations Palestine Mandate, and it became then a part of an international agreement backed by the great powers. But there was all that possibility of it being derailed. In 1922, Lord Balfour was in the House of Lords, and there was a motion that was being pushed to reject the Palestine Mandate. When Lord Balfour rose in the House of Lords and he spoke in support of the declaration that bore his name, his biographers have noted that he spoke with a great deal of passion. For the first time, people saw the intensity of his emotion. He was a very private man. He was a bachelor. He was first an academic and a scholar, a philosopher, before he was a lawyer. But on this occasion in 1922, he led the opposition to the motion on the floor. And he said, and I want to quote to you what he said on that occasion in 1922. There was a great deal involved in Britain's sponsorship of the Jews' return to their homeland. This is the ideal in which chiefly moves me, that Christendom is not oblivious to their faith, is not unmindful of the service they have rendered to the great religions of the world, and that we desire to the best of our ability to give them the opportunity of developing in peace and quietness under British rule those great gifts which hitherto they have been compelled to bring to fruition in countries which know not their language and belong not to their race. The motion was defeated, but Balfour was not the Foreign Secretary. It was now, the Foreign Secretary was Lord Curzon. And what occurred after the defeat of this motion was a release of a white paper which led to the partitioning of Palestine under Lord Curzon and the Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. And 70+% of historic Palestine, the land east of the River Jordan, was separated from the land west of the River Jordan and given over to Abdullah, son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, as the Emir of Transjordan. So ironically, the Balfour Declaration was saved, but an Arab state was created, the state of Transjordan, the Emirate of Transjordan, which is now Jordan. And so indeed, there is an Arab state. What remained was less than 1% of the total land area of the Ottoman Empire between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, which now constitutes the states of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So that 1% remained, and that 1% would then become a matter of great deal of political maneuvering during the interwar years. Okay, so let me just then back up and give you, in a sense, the context of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The context is that the year 1917 became a very critical year. In 1916, December, a new government in London took power under the premiership of David Lloyd, and there was a pressure now built up to bring some sort of a conclusion to the war on the Eastern Front, that is, with the Ottoman. In 1916, the Arab Revolt began in June of 1916, and the flag was raised by the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And the British were desperately interested to see that the Arab Revolt succeed and draw down the Ottoman troops in their area so that they could knock out the Ottoman Empire from the war. In the opening months of 1917, the United States entered the war. And so that meant that by the time the United States mobilized and the pressures came on the Western Front, Britain and France were strategically interested to settle the issue in the Eastern Front. So there was a complex set of negotiation that was undertaken by the British in 1916 and 1917. Britain was engaged in what I might call a quadrangular relationship. One with Russia as an allied power in the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. The other with France, which came to be, in a sense, consummated with the Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916. The third with the Arabs, which is to get them to mobilize and raise the flag of rebellion, the Arab Revolt, with Sharif Hussein of Makkah. And only lastly, in September of 1917, a serious engagement began with the Jewish representatives in London, led by Chaim Weizmann, about considering the Jewish claim to establish a homeland in Palestine, a claim that had begun about 2 decades earlier with the work of Herzl, when Herzl published his book, The Jewish State, in 1896, and in 1897, the first Congress of the World Organization took place in Basel, Switzerland. It is interesting to note that it was exactly 20 years between Herzl's launching the campaign for a Jewish homeland in Palestine and the passage of the Balfour Declaration. But what we have to keep in mind, for the British government and the French, there were other priorities, and they were working on those priorities more seriously, with the focus primarily in defeating the Ottoman Empire. If I may just backtrack a little bit over here, again to contextualize, the man most responsible for the Jewish effort to establish a homeland in Palestine was, of course, Herzl. He is singularly responsible. His book in 1896 galvanized the Jewish opinion, the whole idea for 2 millennia that see you next year in Jerusalem was translated by Herzl into a practical problem, seeking a practical solution to which he devoted his life. So between 1896 and he died in 1904, 8 years, his work had brought this issue right into the capitals of the great powers. Herzl went around and met with all the leaders. He met with the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, in 1898 in Jerusalem. He met with the Sultan of the Ottoman Sultan and the Caliph of Islam, Abdul Hamid II, several times. He went to Rome and he met with the Pope, Pius X, to get his blessing for the effort behind his campaign. But he didn't go very far. It is the war that changed the situation. Wars have consequences. And great wars as was the war of 1914-18, would have great and far-reaching consequences. And so it is in the context of that war that the issue emerged, the Balfour Declaration emerged. Okay, the point, am I running out of time or I still have some time? Large and complex history, but the point I want to drive here is that while Herzl was rebuffed in his effort, and it is the war situation that changed it, the interesting thing to note here, and hopefully we can expand that in our conversation, is that while Balfour was rebuffed by the Pope, almost insultingly, that your people have not recognized our Savior, and therefore they have no place in Palestine. And if they do go to Palestine, then we will have the churches and the priests ready to baptize them. But on the other hand, his meeting with Sultan Hamid, the Caliph of Islam, was, according to his biographers, very warm. The Caliph offered Herzl charter for Mesopotamia. He was reluctant for Palestine, and he was willing to give Herzl and the World Zionist Organization the license for mining natural resources in Fertile Crescent, including oil. And the point here is, the most interesting point, is that from the perspective of the Muslims, the Caliph of Islam, there was no theological objection to the Jews coming back to Palestine. The Caliph knew that in Jerusalem, for instance, on the outbreak of the war, the population of Jerusalem was about 60,000, and 2/3 of that population, over 40,000, were Jews. And that the Jewish settlements on both sides of the Jordan had a population of over 85,000 people. And so, the big question that hangs over our head years later, and all that we've gone through in the 100 years, is what could have happened, might have happened, if instead of the war that the Arabs launched against the Jews in the 1920s, which is continuing right up to this time, they had turned around and embraced the Jews and accepted the Jews have their rights, which the Quran itself testifies to in Palestine. That is in ancient Judean Samaria, the name Palestine given by the Romans, and that Jerusalem is the eternal capital. That possibility was very much there, but in the complexity of the situation that emerged, I wrap this up with the observation that Jewish nationalism came into collision with Arab nationalism. And the result has been disastrous, in a sense, for the Arabs and the Muslims. Perhaps, reflecting back on it, we might open up the avenue for the dialogue and the embracing of the Jews in their ancient land that can lead to the betterment of the Arabs, as the Caliph of Islam himself envisaged at the time that he was speaking with Herzl. Thank you.
Well, Professor, you're a tough act to follow. It's great to see you. I want to say thanks to Joffrey for the invitation. And on the way in, I saw some police officers, and they recognized me from the last time I had an event on this street, and it was with Professor Peterson in attendance as well. And a group of masked thugs tried to storm the room. In fact, outside they flipped over tables. They had their faces obscured. The police held the line, and so the event continued within. But of course, being frustrated, they had pulled the fire alarms, and the police had no other choice but to evacuate the buildings. That's what it's like sometimes to try to have a discussion about anything controversial whatsoever in modern life, in the West, in universities in particular. And so I want to say thanks to the men and women in blue here tonight for keeping us safe, and so far for keeping the fascists at bay. And you know, many people in academia and in the media, and myself included, sometimes criticize police. I can tell you that when there's a mob of masked men looking to smash you, we realize who our real friends are and that blue lives matter. Now, unlike my two friends, I'm not a scholar. I know that will shock you. But what's interesting about both Professor Mansur and Professor Peterson is how, because they have views that aren't even controversial in any deep, essential way, they're just opinions. But because they're out of vogue with the official narrative, in their own way, both men have been marginalized and have paid a personal price for simply stating views that in the past would have been interesting or controversial at most, but they've been flattened by various forms of authority. And Professor Mansur, in his own way, we've talked before about how because you are not following the official narrative of being anti-Zionist, but you're the opposite, that has marginalized you in academia and in fact in some parts of the Muslim community. And Professor Peterson, it's been an international spectacle of how you have been censured, and for the first time in your academic career, denied research funding for your master's students, a shocking act of violation of academic freedom. But the fact that you're here today, invited in this beautiful room, and you're resilient, I think gives us all hope. And Professor Peterson in particular, your use of media, YouTube, social media, I think you have 250,000 YouTube viewers, should give everyone hope that if the authorities, if the establishment denies you one platform, in this day and age with some creativity, you can find yourself another one. I read the Balfour Declaration yesterday thinking I'd better prepare today. And to be honest, I think it's the first time I've ever read it in my life. And I have to say I found it unremarkable. Other than how brief it was, I don't find it remarkable at all, other than Jews are interested in it for personal reasons. Israelis might be interested in it for historical reasons. I understand why we're meeting to talk about its centenary. I suppose, for example, it refutes the claim that the state of Israel's founding was just some appeasement to the Jews for the Holocaust. Well, in 1917, it was promised for its own reasons. I think it proves, obviously, in some way, that Jews predate 1948 in Israel, despite extremist attempts to deracinate Jews from Jerusalem and Israel in general. I think it's a reminder that at that time, the word Palestinian often referred to Jews. What we call the Jerusalem Post today was called the Palestine Post. The Palestinian Brigade in the Second World War were Jews, actually. So it's useful in those ways, but I say again, I found it unremarkable. No more remarkable, I would think, than a declaration today that perhaps the Kurds should have their homeland. In fact, less controversial than that, I think, because the Kurdish homeland, well, does that extend into Turkey, and who has the authority to break up a country? This was an empire saying we will one day concede territory that we control for the Jewish purpose. And over the next 50 or 60 years, how many dozens of countries had the same decolonization from the UK? I mean, if you were to go throughout Africa and other parts of the world, even Asia, the Caribbean, how many versions of the Balfour Declaration would there be? Every Commonwealth country emanated from the British Empire, some before, some after Israel. I would say that the Balfour Declaration was no more controversial than any of those. I would say that Israel's decolonization and becoming an independent state was more successful than most, measured by, well, democratic successes, economic successes, sovereignty, resisting so many attacks, both formal military attacks and terrorism. I think if you look around the world, even especially its immediate neighbors, but even in most countries around the world, I think the only way that Israel stands out by most meaningful ways is that it is more successful than more countries that were decolonized from the British Empire. But I had tuned out Israel and Jewish and Palestinian and terrorism issues for quite a long time. I was just overdosed on them. And I hadn't been to Israel for 10 years until I went recently this spring with some of my colleagues from the Rebel.media. And I thought I sort of knew it already and would be tired to hear it, but I learned something this trip that I didn't know before. And I later verified it for myself. I had heard, when I was in Israel a couple months ago, that all of Israel's wars and all of its terrorist attacks combined over the last century, so going back to the Balfour Declaration, really since the 20s, 30s, 40s, the War of Independence in 48, all the other conflicts, Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, the incursion into Lebanon, all the intifadas, the total casualties on both sides, so not just on the Israeli side, but on the Palestinian side, on other foreign Arab countries, the total casualties over the course of 1 century was just over 100,000. Now, of course, any one death in a war or a terrorist attack is a tragedy, but we have to have some perspective in an era when hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed in 5 years by their own government, by terrorist insurgents in Libya, where massacres happened by ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Looking at the horrors of the region, the subject that so obsesses international opinion, the United Nations, the diplomatic corps, the media corps, the political establishment, is so incredibly disproportionate. I mean, just do a little tour around the region. Erdogan and his mass arrests and the coup against him, whether it was a real or a false flag. Look at that horror show. Look at the way he treats Americans when he and his entourage come to Washington, D.C. just this week. Look at what's going on in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the entire region is aflame. By comparison, Israel is the most placid place in the region. It is the closest thing to a solution in the region, and even some Arab states are saying so, and not just in private anymore. Israel may actually be a solution to some of the military or terroristic or nuclear problems in the region. One thing I knew from my last trip to Israel a decade ago was that even the security barrier that's mainly a fence, and a few percentage of its miles is a wall between that separates Jewish communities and Arab communities, that was built to stop suicide bombers who would just walk across the field and blow themselves up. There have been dozens of lawsuits to the Israeli Supreme Court to change the path of that fence. And in all the cases, the lawsuits by Palestinians have been to put them on the inside of the wall, on the Israeli side, not under the Palestinian Authority. And this was confirmed again for me when I was at a point at the Golan Height looking out over, we saw both Syria and Lebanon, and we heard shooting down below. It was probably not ISIS. We were told what other terrorist group it might be. And I saw a group of Israeli Arab students there, and they came up to our little rebel team, and I thought, well, let's talk to these kids. And I just started asking them the simplest question: is there any other country you'd rather be in? What do you make of this outcropping? What are your teachers teaching you at your Arab Muslim school about the Golan Heights. What do you think of Syria? Is there a... And I was stunned, and you can find this video on our website, rebelisrael.com. There was no... all these kids, there was not another country in the world they would prefer to live in. And it was just such a counterblast to the official narrative that Israel is the problem, that there is no peace unless you solve the Israeli problem. You must force Israel and the Palestinians together in some sort of alchemy before you can even start to tackle other problems. It was insane before, but in the era of ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Arab Spring that has turned into such a horror show, it's even more absurd today. I think that although the political classes and the diplomatic classes are still obsessed by the peace process, not by peace itself, and I think most Israelis have abandoned the idea that there will be peace. They're after quiet more, I think. I think, to use a phrase that the kids use these days, I think Israel has given an example for some Westerners on how to be red-pilled in this era. That's the phrase from the movie The Matrix. Do you want to see the harsh reality and come to terms with it? Take the red pill. Or do you want to go back to your illusion? Take the blue pill. Israel is red-pilled in the era of terrorism, anti-democratic forces. Israel is the society that is no longer going through security theater, that's no longer pretending there aren't issues, and a borderless society works. And I think in many ways, although Israel has more terrorism problems and problems with Islamic radicalism than Western countries, because they have come to terms with them and are willing to call them by the proper name, I think in some ways that it's safer to be in Israel, because at least they call the threat by its own name. How many minutes do I have left? 7 minutes? I'm just going to unlock my iPhone where I put my very rough notes. I think that that on campuses and in the media, the Palestinian issue is grossly disproportionate, but I don't even think it's legitimate. I think it is just as when the decline and defeat of the Soviet Union came, Marxism and socialism rebundled itself, for example, in environmentalism. So the anti-industry, anti-corporate, anti-capitalist mentality found a new home in environmentalism. I think that a lot of the angst and motivation and, frankly, the funding for anti-Israel extremism on campus that obsesses over Israel and Palestine is a sublimation of other anti-Western hates that would have been called the disarmament movement in league with the, in sympathy with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I think that's simply where that radical counterculture has gone. And I don't think it could possibly be legitimate that the #1 political cause in every campus in North America and many in Western Europe is Israel and Palestine. It doesn't make sense politically or demographically or militarily or statistically in any way other than it is just simply the metamorphosis of that anti-Western sentiment, because Israel is the red-pilled bulwark against the madness of the anti-West. I think that is its way to work its way into Western civilization through our campuses and through the media. As you can see, I'm not a professor, and as you can see, I'm not as well studied in these matters as Professor Mansur. But I did want to leave you with that one point, which is, I like talking about Israel because I'm Jewish, so I have an affinity for it. And in the same way, I have an affection for Taiwan because it's the little democracy standing next to the big tyrant. I have no ethnic affiliation with Taiwan, but I find them deeply sympathetic. The fact that they're marginalized in world affairs and called not a real country and delegitimized, I find a connection with them. I feel sympathetic with them. I feel they're hard done by in the same way, yet you don't see an anti-Taiwan mania across the West. People are not obsessed by Taiwan around the world. It too is an unusual success story as little countries go. But I guess where I stand on the issue is that I reject the idea at all that Israel is an important global issue to be dealt with. I reject that it should be at the center of political debates, of diplomatic debates, of historical debates. No one counts how many angels dance on the head of a pin when we look at the Mexico-California border. Sure, you have some La Raza extremists, but no one relitigates that border. No one relitigates Alaska and Russia. That's the settled history. I think it's fake news. I think it's fake politics. And I think we have to look at who's beneath it, who's funding it, whether it's foreign countries or counterculture leftists like the Tides Foundation or the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, who before the Cold War ended were supportive of anti-Western organizations just in a different name. So I guess I'm here to say I'm learning a lot about the Balfour Declaration, but I actually don't think it's an important issue. I think it's what the other side wants to make an important issue. It's good to know the rebuttals to their junk history and junk claims, but I think we should have an earlier step, which is to call the bluff on anyone who says Israel and its relations with its neighbors is an important world problem. I just don't think it is. Thank you.
So I puzzled over this for quite a while, pretty much right up to the last 2 or 3 hours before the talk. I thought, what in the world am I doing at this talk? So the first hypothesis I generated was that maybe I was an amateur historian. And you know, one of the things you learn when you're trying to teach something is just bloody well how little you know about it. And so I started to dig more deeply into the history of the Balfour Declaration, although I knew Salim was going to cover it. And, you know, I could give a pretty credible 20-minute presentation on the history of the Balfour Declaration, but it didn't sit well with me because it isn't the right thing for me to be talking about. It's not my area of expertise. And to say anything about the political situation, like anything definitive, it's like, that just seemed like absolute hubris. You know, I mean, there's so much going on in that little corner of the world that for me to take a position of solution on it just seemed absurd. And I thought, okay, well, I'm no historian and I don't have any answers, so what in the world, where in the world does that leave me? And then I thought, well, I remembered something that Hans Eysenck, who's a very famous psychologist, said about the complexity of the world, let's say, and that formulating the damn problem is often a really good step to solving it. And I thought, well, I can certainly see where the problems are, and maybe I can see them from a psychological perspective. And so what I ended up doing was listing a bunch of problems. And so I'm going to talk to you about why. You see, and it was kind of interesting today how this laid itself out, because Salim provided some history, and then Ezra talked personally and historically, but he also talked psychologically. You know, one of the questions that he raised, not explicitly, precisely, but implicitly, but evidently, was like, who cares? Why is this so important? Why is this little ratty part of the world that's like just scraped out of useless desert, fundamentally? Why in the world is everyone obsessed with it? You know, and it's really something. It's always struck me. And so I thought, well, maybe that was something a psychologist could talk about. You know, one of the things that struck me when Ezra was speaking is that, you know, maybe even the enemies of the Jews perversely respect them because they've done so well in the Middle East that it's just annoying. Hey, like, you don't want to be thinking that success is necessarily going to attract admiration, right? I mean, we know from the Cain and Abel story that success can attract murderous resentment and the desire to destroy. And so that's just one of the problems, I think, is that in some ways Israel is a shining beacon on the hill. And of course, in some ways, I suppose it's not. But at least in part it is, and that's something, especially in that God-forsaken part of the world. So where there's very little sign of anything resembling the city of God. And then I thought, well, let's think about Israel. And it's a small place. And the conflicts are small scale, but vital. And I was thinking today about the fact that the geographical area is small, but the psychological or spiritual area is very large, right? I mean, because Israel happens to have Jerusalem in the middle of it, which I suppose is quite amazing, but also very problematic, because Jerusalem is regarded as a holy city by all three, roughly, Western religions. And the idea of the holy city is a really interesting idea. You know, it's half geographical and half psychological. It's more psychological, from my perspective, than geographical. I suppose that's probably because well, we won't get into that, but it's more psychological than it is geographical from my perspective. But the idea of the holy city is really worth thinking about, because I think it's part of the reason that this part of the world compels so much attention, because all three Western religions have a vision, you know, and they differ in their vision, but there's some shared elements. Like one of the shared elements is that there is such a thing as a holy city. And what's a holy city? It's a very old idea. I mean, it's a tremendously old idea. It's something like, for human beings, it's like the sanctity of the community itself, you know, because the community is a place that's predicated on the ultimate value, and that it's walled in, and then it's surrounded by chaos and barbarism, essentially. And it's home. It's the ideal. It's the proper polity. It's the ideal state. It's the hope for the future. That's also what it is. And it's the utopia. It's heaven on earth. It's paradise. It's Eden reestablished. It's the place where all suffering disappears, right? It's the vision of humanity. And all three major Western religions agree that such a place exists, and that it actually happens to exist in Jerusalem, and that it's actually real. And, you know, that's actually quite remarkable degree of agreement, especially about something that's so metaphysical and strange, and also so ancient. Well, it's interesting that we've come to agreement about that, although it's certainly the case that we haven't come to much agreement about exactly how the city of God should be ruled. And that's where the problems come, I suppose, because, as you all know, the devil, and in this case probably literally so, is always in the details. And so I believe that Israel and Jerusalem is a microcosm of the human longing for the return of paradise, let's say that. And that we're all involved in a tremendous drama and watching it play itself out in this tiny corner of the world, where Muslims and Jews and Christians are forced painfully and horribly to confront one another at the deepest level of reality. Well, so what are the problems? Well, one of them is that people lie all the time about exactly what's going on in Israel and why they're on one side or the other. You know, they lie because they're malevolent, because they want destruction, because they're jealous, because they're anti-Semitic, because they're anti-Islamic, because they're anti-Christian, because they resent success. That's a big problem. Another problem is, well, all three religions make a group-oriented claim to rights to the territory. And then, well, then that raises a terrible specter, because it's the specter of group rights, right? Is that groups have the right to self-determination, and that groups can have a historical claim to a piece of geography. And of course, that spins us into a terrible conflict between the idea of group identity and the idea of individual rights, and we have no idea how to sort that out. And then the problem of group identity and historical claims is magnified by the problem of time frame. And this is a major psychological problem, man. It's like, well, you think about, say, the common complaint that the Western colonialists say we're responsible for the divisions of the Middle East. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. If you stop history if you start history at 1917, after the Allies won the First World War and took down the Ottoman Empire, and in the aftermath of the collapse of the European monarchies, you could say, well, England and France had the upper hand and they arbitrarily divided up the Middle East, but you could just as easily say that, well, the damn empire had collapsed and they had to do something with it, and it wasn't obvious, and they gave some of it to the Arabs, who really didn't have any land to begin with, or not any independent land, that's for sure, because they were dominated by the Ottoman Empire, and they decided to give some of it to the Jews, and well, maybe that wasn't the world's best solution either way, but they were maybe making the best of a bad lot. I mean, that's certainly one way of thinking about it. And then, if you stretch your historical imagination back several thousand years, well, then you can say, well, the Jews have a historical claim to Palestine, let's say, and to Jerusalem. But the problem is, well, why take that particular frame of history? You can take any frame of history you want, and then the conclusions that you draw from the facts that you observe differ substantially. And that's a big psychological problem, because it's not easy to determine what the appropriate time frame is to analyze the significance of historical events, and no one knows how to deal with that problem. And so at least we could say it's a problem, because it clearly is. And it's part of the reason, I think, why Palestine and the conflict there just never leaves the Western imagination. That's another major cognitive problem, a cognitive historical problem in some sense that we don't know how to solve. We don't know how to solve the problem of proxies. It could be that the Israelis and the Palestinians would actually like peace, but it doesn't matter because they're surrounded by people who can use them to, especially the Palestinians in my estimation, to continue to agitate for their extracurricular political motives, and if they have to sacrifice the Palestinians to do it, well, so much the better. That solves more than one problem at the same time. And so that is another indication of precisely why the problem is so absurdly complicated. There's another one too, which is the problem of group identity and the state as salvation. This is a deep problem. No one ever talks about this. This is actually, I would say, one of the places where Christianity and Judaism differ most intently, and maybe I'm wrong about this, and I probably am, because I'm wrong about lots of things, but it seems to me that there's more emphasis in Judaism that the state is the locus of salvation than there is in Christianity, which seems to stress the individual as locus of salvation more precisely. Now, perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle, because people have a cultural identity and an individual identity, but I'm not trying to offer solutions because I can't. I'm trying to outline problems, as we don't know how. Like, you have a group identity, which is convenient for you to use whenever you need to use it, but it's kind of annoying for everyone when someone else's group identity starts to interfere with your individual rights. And like, we're in a terrible battle in Canada and across the Western world, for that matter, with regards to the relationship between group identity and individual rights. And so that's pinpointed tremendously in Israel, right? It's like laser focus there. Well, we don't know how to deal with that. So, and then the other thing is that you could view Israel as the nexus, the pinpoint, another pinpoint, where the first world and the third world come together and clash. And Israel is essentially a first world country, and it's been heavily involved. It's been heavily allied with the West, let's put it that way, and extraordinarily successfully. And Israel has a tech industry that's just booming. It's amazingly well-educated society and could offer a tremendous amount to the world in the upcoming years. And it's thriving in the midst of this third world chaos. And, well, do we know what to do about that? No. And are they thriving because they're exploiting everyone around them and exploiting everyone in the state? Because that's the new idea about the West, right, is that the reason the West thrives is because we've stolen everything of value from all the people around the world who aren't thriving. And, of course, there's enough truth in that so that it's difficult just to toss it out. But, of course, it's an extraordinarily malevolent argument, and it ignores completely let's say, the economic value of a peaceful, law-abiding, and honest state, which I do believe, all things considered, we actually have managed to establish in the West, if you compare the West to everywhere else in the world, except for, instead of some dubious, generally radical leftist utopia, one execution away from utopia. That's the vision of the left. So... And then there's another problem. It's like, well, it's the problem of the victim versus the oppressor, right? And it's always victim versus oppressor. That's the thing that's so awful. And I see that from a psychological perspective too, because If you think of yourself as a victim, then you don't think of yourself as an oppressor. Well, then you've got it wrong, man, because you're victim and oppressor at the same time. But it's way easier to separate the world into the victims that I'm defending, you know, and hopefully don't have to be in the same category as, because that would be, you know, then I can have my cake and eat it too. And all those terrible oppressors out there that aren't me. And, you know, that's a psychological divide, because if you're such a fool that you think you're only victim and not oppressor, then there's so much you don't know about humanity and society that well, I don't even know what the proper metaphor for that is. You haven't even begun your journey to wisdom. Let's put it that way. That would be the right way to think about it. And so, you know, the whole victim versus oppressor, the horrible victim versus oppressor mythology can be laid out again in the Israeli state. And then it depends on who you want to make victim and who you want to make oppressor. It's exactly the perfect situation for that, because you can look at the historical catastrophes that assaulted the Jewish people, which are absolutely undeniable, or you can take the side of the Palestinians. Take your choice. You can do your moral virtue signaling on both sides of the argument, and so that's extraordinarily convenient, especially if you don't have anything else to do. So, and that, you know, that ties into the problem of virtual signaling, because it's also very convenient for people who want to develop a sense of their own advanced morality to take on the problems of some distant state and wave their bloody banners and their protest signs in favor of the hypothesis and proposition that they're on the side of the moral right, when they can go home to their comfortable lives and never have to lift a finger in anything resembling real effort or put any real risk into it. And of course, that's what they're taught to do in the universities, because we don't have anything better to teach young people than that at the moment. So, you know, so what's the issue? Well, the issue is, why is that battle so absolutely fascinating? And the answer is because it contains a microcosm, at least, of the Western world. And I mean the broad Western world, right? Muslims, Jews, Christians, the whole messy, horrible shebang of it. And it puts it in front of us every single day, every single day. And the funny thing is we can't bloody well look away from it, right? Because there's something in all of us that's maybe aiming at the city of God, and we know that it's allied in some peculiar metaphysical sense with that dusty little country and the city of Jerusalem, you know, the holy city on the hill. And it calls at all of our consciences to be better people than we are, and to treat other people properly, and to live proper lives. And we're not doing that well enough, and you can tell, because there's plenty of catastrophe that remains in the city that's supposed to be holy to all three of the fundamental cultures that make up our civilization. So, that's all I have to say about that.